Hello YouTube. So I've tried to make this video a number of times and it's actually really difficult. This is a very difficult video to make, and the reason why is that the thing that I want to talk about is unclear to me. So forgive me if I meander a little bit, but I want to talk about as though meandering is something that I've never done before. I want to talk for a moment about Gary Edwards and his view of an empirical left, which strikes me as a really strange sort of proposition or claim to make. A strange stance, right? Social naturalism. The way Gary is articulating it seems to be up to three different things here at the same time. And I don't really know how to read it beyond that, but I want to quickly touch on the three different things that I think he's talking about. First of all, he seems to have identified a trend in the left that he deems to be anti-science, whatever that. I don't know what that trend is, and I don't know. I need more details there because I don't know what it is. Maybe we could talk about GMOs or something, because I think the left has become anti-scientific in that way, and maybe like anarcho-primitivists can be safely labeled as anti-science. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that there is a strain on the left that has kind of decided, hey, let's all go work on a farm somewhere, and sort of disengage from political life. There's a sort of I would even, a sort of pastoral, even potentially proto-fascist longing for pre-technological worlds that I think is at work in the left, or at least that's been my experience. So maybe he's thinking of those things, in which case I would join him in his criticism. But I don't think that's what he's thinking about, because I don't think that these are the things that he's exposed to in this discourse. So that's first of all. He wants to claim that something in the world that he's seeing in the political left is anti-science. All right. Again, a very vague proposition to me. Maybe he's thinking of intersectionality, but again, I think that this is actually just a concept that he's failing to grasp. But I'll just leave that suspended. So that's one. Two would be that he thinks that our best empirical theories can inform our political commitments. Great. I agree. And I think that, but I think that the only criticism I have there is that it's trivial. I think that we all recognize this. Climate change is the example that I would point to. It's quite clear that our political commitments have been shaped in many ways by scientific findings with respect to climate change, and I think that this is something that the left has in many ways dropped the ball on, actually, but at least the left recognizes that it's an issue to think about and talk about. So if he wants to say that the empirical sciences can inform our political commitments, I don't think anybody disagrees with that, actually. The third thing that he seems to want to say is that we can explain social phenomena in naturalistic terms. To which I say, okay. And I think that that's a very difficult this is the one that he seems to be thinking about most most consciously, or the thing that he's trying to sort of make a case for most most rigorously. And I must confess that I think that this is something that strikes me as potentially dubious, not because I think it's in principle impossible, but I think that practically speaking, it's a dangerous gesture to make in many ways. Of course, we can, in principle, explain social phenomena in naturalistic terms. Gary and I very likely agree on this. However, I just don't know exactly how he's planning on doing that in practice. I don't know what he's prescribing in that statement, what sort of method or what things are being overlooked. Maybe it's just a question of ignorance on my case, on my front. When we talk about society in, I guess, naturalistic terms, in many ways we're talking about behavior. And, I mean, when we look, what are the relevant sciences to questions of human behavior? It's going to be, I guess, empirical psychology, it's going to be neurology, it's going to be genetics, right? Maybe embryology or something like that, right? I imagine that can inform, I believe embryological conditions can very likely inform behavioral patterns. Actually, I think it's obvious that that's true. Now, what I want to point out is that all of those sciences are in a really interesting state, as Gary no doubt knows, is aware of. All of these sciences have been enabled quite radically by technology, by the advent of computers, right, and the internet, etc. Moore's law. We do see these sciences in a very dynamic and exciting state right now. However, I think that along with that comes the fact that we are realizing more and more just how little we know and just how complex the problems are with respect to neurology or something. Neurology or genetics, for instance. We don't know how genetics affects human behavior, I mean, to any reliable degree. We can talk about tendencies, right? We can talk about trends, right? In a very generalized way, but that's kind of where we're at right now. That seems like an uncontroversial statement to make. Even neurology, as far as I am aware of it, is a huge site of contest, right? I mean, it's not like we have a theory of the brain, a working theory of the brain. We have a whole lot of information. It's been stated before that neurology is in a situation where they're sort of we need an Einstein, right, for neurology right now. At least that's my understanding of the situation. I'm sure Gary is much more well-versed in literature than I am, and so please correct me if I'm wrong in these assessments. It's just kind of my understanding. So with all this knowledge in all of these relevant fields kind of coming together and producing a greater understanding of what it means for us to be natural beings, again, it's an exciting time, but it's also a time of great sort of instability. And I do have a good amount of discomfort with the idea that we can make use in any rigorous way of, well, no, we very likely can make use of neurology and genetics. I don't mean to say that we can't. But I'd say that we're not in a position where we can explain behavior, much less social phenomenon, in those terms. Not yet, right? I mean, it may be possible someday. I'm not sure if that's a good possibility or a bad possibility, honestly. That seems to have all sorts of dangers built into it that are interesting. So if the relevant sciences are in a position where perhaps we can have some insight, right? We can develop some insight into who we are and into various social phenomena. If we're sort of getting into that position, that's great. However, until we can really do that, until we can really undertake that project, we kind of have to do what we do, right? I mean, it's not ignorance that the social sciences hasn't adopted such methods. It's that, or hasn't sort of taken on questions of genetics and neurology in quite the way that he'd like. And that's at an academic level, right? And as we know, those concepts end up being sort of filtered into the activist level, right? I think that Gary's beef is really with activists rather than with academics. I think that the academics that those activists are citing are illegible to Gary. I think that he has difficulty. I don't think he. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'd just ask you, Gary. Have you really sat down and read someone like Judith Butler, right? Or Foucault, or someone like that? Because these are the places that they're getting their analyses from, and I think they're mishandling them in interesting ways, even. So yeah, it's not out of ignorance that the natural sciences haven't been made use of more. I think it's just that there is a history of attempts to naturalize power relations through recourse to the natural sciences. You know that damn well, and I think we would both be united in declaring that bad science, right? You can think of eugenics, you can think of phrenology, you can think of etc., right? There's just a long history of people trying to justify unjust power relations through recourse to the natural sciences. With that history as the background, I don't think it's too much to ask to say, well, maybe we would like things to be solid, right? Scientifically in a way that the relevant discourses only seem to be starting to be able to be solid in that way. And then they should be criticized as well, right? That's the empirical stance, is it not? The sciences, of course, should be criticized. Because that's what it is. It's this strange thing to me where if I leverage, or what I just said before about things like phrenology, Gary might take that as me assuming an anti-scientific stance. I don't think that is me assuming a scientific stance. I think it's me assuming a scientific stance, because I think it is implicit in the sciences that we should be worried about those kinds of things. It's implicit in the sciences that we should be worried about bad science, and we should criticize bad science, and we should be skeptical, right? And I don't think that, and again, I don't think that that makes me anti-science to say that. If I'm worried about naturalizing a power relationship in an illegitimate way, right? Saying, for instance, you can find this with gay marriage, find that gesture. It's unnatural for two men to be together, right? In matrimony. That's a recourse to nature, right? The gesture of pointing to nature and saying that thing is fixed, that thing cannot change, especially when we're talking about like political commitments and how to organize our social reality. I don't think that we should be more skeptical about anything else in the world. And so I don't know how Gary's